When we look at the character Richard from the amazing world of Gumball, it's pretty easy to notice his flaws. For example, he's one of the laziest characters I've ever seen in a cartoon. Most of the time, the guy is lying on the couch eating something, doing absolutely nothing but watching TV and sleeping. Richard hates when others expect him to do anything, no matter how small, and he doesn't really care about what's happening around him. He always tries to avoid being given tasks by pretending to be asleep or using any excuse he can think of. When Nicole assigns him a task, he almost always shows that he can't handle even the lightest responsibility. He usually gets confused, messes everything up, and ends up failing at the task, or even doing the exact opposite of what Nicole asked him to do. Essentially, he's terrible with any kind of responsibility. If we pay attention to his actions, flaws, and mindset, we notice the trait that most defines Richard: childishness. Everything about him revolves around this trait throughout the show. Almost every time he appears, he's acting immaturely, like a child, sometimes even worse than the kids themselves. He cries when he doesn't get what he wants. He can't deal with his mother remarrying. He struggles to behave in social settings or follow rules. One episode that perfectly illustrates how his immaturity can annoy Nicole is The Limit. In this episode, she repeatedly tells Richard and the kids not to put candy in the shopping cart, but they keep doing it anyway. Richard, who should be setting an example for his kids, instead behaves just as childishly as they do. This frustrates Nicole to the point where she completely loses her temper and explodes. As we know, Richard isn't a very intelligent character, and this low level of intelligence contributes to his many mistakes. It makes him an incompetent person who often can't do anything right. He frequently messes things up, leaving other family members irritated or disappointed. He simply lacks the ability to handle basic tasks and situations like an adult would. Of course, all of this makes Richard hilarious, which is exactly the point of his character in the show. But did you know there's actually a syndrome that describes the behavior Richard exhibits? It's called the Peter Pan syndrome. This syndrome triggers childish and insecure behaviors in individuals, preventing them from fully maturing like others. As a result, they struggle with many aspects of adult life. These individuals refuse to grow up, are deeply afraid of being judged by others, and often fail to take on responsibilities. There's a scene in one episode that perfectly illustrates this fear. Richard needs to go to the school with Nicole for a parent-teacher meeting, but Nicole has to force him into the car because he desperately tries to avoid going. He shows an enormous fear of seeing his old teacher again, being judged by her, and stepping into a school after all these years. In his mind, he still doesn't feel like an adult. This syndrome is named after Peter Pan because it's as if people with it live in an imaginary world where they don't have to grow up. They struggle to succeed in professional or family relationships. Looking at Richard, we notice he's never employed, and his family relationships are not exactly great either. Nicole is often overwhelmed, angry, and anxious because she has to handle practically everything on her own. She also shows clear dissatisfaction with Richard for being the way he is. The fear of living in the real world is so strong that individuals with this syndrome can't let go of a parental figure and remain dependent on them. Thinking about it, Nicole is often more of a mother to Richard than a wife. In many moments, it's as if he's just another child she has to take care of, telling him how to behave or what he can and can't do since he lacks awareness. Richard is extremely dependent on Nicole for almost everything, as people with this syndrome are often incapable of taking care of themselves or taking responsibility for their actions. Consequently, they cling to a responsible figure to solve their problems and save them. One of the main causes of this syndrome is having an overly happy and comfortable childhood, which leads to difficulties in facing the challenges of adulthood, where there was little to no encouragement from caregivers for the child to take on more responsibilities and mature. There's literally an episode entirely focused on Richard's incompetence as an adult who doesn't know how to do anything because his mother did everything for him when he was a child. This prevented Richard from thinking for himself, solving his own problems, or developing any sense of responsibility. As an adult, he remained incapable of independent thought or living without someone to take care of him. The irony is that his mother's justification for this behavior was to keep him safe. However, her overprotection ended up putting Richard in danger many times as an adult because he had no idea what to do in any situation. His upbringing was undoubtedly the root cause of his Peter Pan syndrome. If you know someone who fits this description, It's important to approach them with patience and empathy. Most of the time, they can't control their behavior or even realize there's an issue. This is something that requires psychological treatment, and if you identify with what's being described here, the first step is acknowledging that you have a problem and seeking professional help to improve and have a better life. I know change can be terrifying, and growing up itself is scary. It's a series of changes and endings, but we can't afford to stay children forever. We can't afford to live in Neverland because it isn't real. What is real, however, is the land of regrets. It's a place so crowded with people who stay there forever that you can't even count them all. So don't be afraid to grow up. Don't fear the world. Don't fear pain. Don't even fear fear itself. It's all part of life, and every one of us is doing the best we can. Above the door leading out of your comfort zone, there's a sign that says, "Live," but maybe you've never read it because you've always stayed too far from that door.